Well, give her your good profile at least.
It's hard to hold it still.
That means he shouldn't breathe if he doesn't move.
Anyway, every old lady could actually got your music statement too. Okay, so just show me the second one.
Hi.
Yeah, that's good. Lower.
Lower.
Yeah, good. A little lower.
Did you go look at the Calder show?
No, I haven't.
I saw it last night. You have to go look.
Really?
And you have to go up the street to the...
Rediscovered artist, and rediscovered American Impressionist painter, who Jack Bauer found. He had known about him vaguely when he was a curator at the Brooklyn Museum, and had written Theodore Wendell's son about, I don't know, some incredible story. I don't know, it'll be in the Art News article, Art in America article, about 25 years ago, and got a response about a year ago. And this is the result.
That's why he didn't have a show in 60 some odd years.
So anyway, that's what this exhibition is.
There are some people that are seated outside. I think there's room in here if you'd prefer to come in, unless you find that more comfortable. But there is room inside. Isn't there room back there?
There's noise outside, so it's hard to hear.
That'll all end at 6 o'clock.
Well, then
it
why
should
don't
be.
you come
That's the
inside?
guards who are about to go home, I think.
Take the chair and climb over the
Is that the guards talking? They're going to be leaving in about 2 minutes. The men in blue? The men in blue, are they talking?
We are voting.
You are ready?
We are recording.
Oh,
Oh, you're recording? You go.
well then we will. You're accustomed to that. I saw your show on the, I called her on the Today Show today.
Oh, good.
I think we'll begin now. Is everybody comfortable? I would appreciate it if you are standing to please be seated, and I've asked you each week to try to bring something to sit on. There are some people, I guess they...
I feel very uncomfortable in this lovely Breuer chair. It makes me feel sort of aloof. I'm about to.
Theodore Wendell.
Theodore Wendell.
And does
There'll be
this
an
open
article in
tomorrow?
Art in America, and this show will be here for about 6 weeks. And this little brochure is available tomorrow, which gives his biography, checklist of the paintings, and a short introduction to his work.
I'm ready if you are.
Sure. Fire away.
Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. Tonight we are at New York's Whitney Museum. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and our distinguished guest, the museum's director, Thomas Armstrong III. Tom Armstrong has been the director of the nation's oldest museum and one of its most distinguished art schools, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. He was the associate director of the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Collection in Williamsburg, Virginia, before coming to the Whitney Museum in 1973. Tom, having been the director of 3 outstanding museums in 3 distinctly different locations, how do you compare the life of a museum director in this city?
Well, this is hectic. This is the first museum I've ever worked for that you had to raise large amounts of money. And I must tell you that a great deal of my time is devoted to that. It's an interesting city in those terms because the sources of money are limited. Private money is limited, and we all sort of seem to go after the same people. So it's not like a one museum town. Philadelphia has the same problem, but for instance, Dallas doesn't have that problem. Dallas has one museum, the museum. Boston has the Boston Museum. They have others as well, but anyway, the patronage is primarily for the Boston Museum. There's a patronage problem that you certainly don't have in Williamsburg. Williamsburg now, though, is beginning to raise private funds. They just got a $4 million grant from the Wallace Foundation, the Wallaces, And it's the largest grant they've been given since the original gift by John D. Rockefeller Jr.
Isn't there some movement underfoot for federal funding for that too, and state funding?
I think so. I don't really know. But Williamsburg even is beginning to raise private money. The Pennsylvania Academy situation was a fascinating one because it represents in a microcosm what has gone on in the museum history in this country. Pennsylvania Academy was founded in 1805, was founded by Charles Wilson Peale, William Rush, and a bunch of Philadelphia lawyers. It developed into the strongest institution in the 19th century in this country, both an art school and a museum. A great 19th century collection. And when the Philadelphia Museum was established in 1876, which is the sort of the period when great museums in this country were established, the Met, the Boston, the Philadelphia, most people were beginning to recognize European painting and were collecting European painting and not paying very much attention to American painting. So the attention shifted from something like the Pennsylvania Academy to the Philadelphia Museum. And American art declined in interest for the general public and for patrons. I mean, Aikens, for instance, was not collected very extensively in his lifetime. Most American artists were not at the end of the 19th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, you then have Mrs. Whitney's activities, which I'll talk about more maybe. Anyway, when I arrived in Philadelphia, the fellow that preceded me had been fired, so there was no way to go but up, which is an interesting situation in itself. Everything you do is better than what he did. And here I was with this great building by Frank Furness, who was represents a rediscovered American architect, that had been considered a dirty old Victorian building in Philadelphia. The Board of Trustees was about to sell the collection, or they were thinking of moving it anyway. They were about to sell the building to Vincent Kling, or there was one trustee who wanted to, and he was getting a lot of attention. And all of the city patronage went to the Philadelphia Museum. Well, the interesting problem was to convince Philadelphians they had a unique situation. There were other museums as great as the Philadelphia Museum, but nobody had the Pennsylvania Academy. And it was a fast. You could be very rude with them. You could cajole them. You could push them around, because you could illustrate to them that right in their front yard they had something they'd ignored. Well, they came around, and after I departed, we got a group of people to come in to impress Philadelphians. They love the opinions of outsiders. Most people do, and it was people like Blanchette Rockefeller and John Coolidge and Jules Prown and Luke. A couple of artists. Anyway, Bud Leek, who was head of the Maryland Institute. Anyway, these people wrote a report and convinced the Pennsylvania Academy that they really had something. And they raised $5 million, and they've restored the building. And Philadelphia was an interesting article in the Philadelphia newspaper that Philadelphia went through an awful time during this year because all these renovation projects and everything were budgeted in anticipation of great bicentennial events, none of which were successful. The attendance at the Pennsylvania Academy, I think, I heard it the other day, between, I think, May and August was 20,000 people.
And they projected astronomical
numbers. Oh, they projected
numbers.
Hundreds, yeah.
Museum director told me the other day that he spends about 40% of his time fundraising and in non-essential, non-museum activities. I guess there was a time when a museum director was a scholar, and now more and more of his time is given to cultivating patrons, raising funds. Do you see any solution to that problem?
No, I enjoy it. I don't want a solution. I must say, everything I do is essential, and everything I do is a museum activity.
Well, I
don't think the government is going to step in and take over museums. I mean, that's sort of everybody talks about. More government funding. I have lunch with the head of the Crest Foundation. I then talk with some people who want to give us some material, some Birchfield material. I then go and see a private collection. I then write the man that has the greatest private collection of Calder's, convincing him that this is the museum of American art, and that our great dream is to have a permanent installation of 20th century American art. And if he gives us his Calder collection, it'll be the jewel of that installation, et cetera, et cetera. All day, it's pursuing towards some sort of an objective. And that happens to be my personal way of operating. I could never be, well, one of the jobs that's open is the Boston Museum. And various people are trying to be the director of the Boston Museum. I shouldn't really say this on television. Anyway, because if I'm offered it, it'll be twice the salary I make, so I might reconsider it. It's a custodial job in my estimation. I mean, it's the kind of job. The Boston Museum is a great museum, all right? You can improve the collection, you can interpret it better than your predecessors, you can add great works of art. This museum is on sort of a threshold situation, and I enjoy that. I think it has a sort of future to realize. The Pennsylvania Academy did, folk art did when I was there. Nobody had recognized folk art very much.
You say this museum is on a threshold. Perhaps that is why there is some confusion in the mind of the public as to what its focus is. Perhaps you can clarify that.
Well, its focus has never been different than the day it was founded, but people are certainly confused about it, and I think I understand why. The museum was founded in 1930 by a woman who was helping American artists. She was helping artists much more than she was collecting art. I mean, she realized that American artists at that point were not collected, not encouraged, not shown extensively, and so forth. So at the time, Mrs. Rockefeller, for instance, was founding the Museum of Modern Art to bring European art to the attention of American artists. Mrs. Whitney was founding the Whitney to assist American artists to show their work, to assisting them in their
Why
endeavors.
don't you give us the genesis, the evolution of Mrs. Whitney's school to the museum as well?
Well, she was a very wealthy woman, I mean, extraordinarily wealthy, and who the paradox in my mind is that she came from a I don't know anybody today like this. She came from an aspect of society, a part of society that you normally don't associate with activities that she pursued. In other words, she grew up in a house bigger than Bergdorf Goodman's, on the site of Bergdorf Goodman's, where all the interior fireplaces were by St. Gaudens and so forth. Married to Harry Payne Whitney, who a great polo player, married at the Breakers, and so forth. In 1907, she was an artist. She was a sculptor. So she associated with other artists through that. In 1907, she began to realize that her friends, her artist friends, were in great difficulty because nobody was doing anything for them. So she had a show for Ernest Lawson at the Colony Club in 1907. In 1908, she bought 4 of the 7 paintings that were sold out of the 8 exhibition at the Macbeth Gallery, and then she was off and running. She paid for the decorations and other aspects of the Armory show. Then she founded the Whitney Studio Club, which was a sort of a fraternal association kind of for artists who could drop in and draw from the model for a quarter, have some entertainment fraternity and so forth, and exhibit their work. She used to invent activities for them. She had, paint a picture in a week and all this business. I mean, it was sort of fun and games, but it created a sort of fraternity amongst the people that she helped. And that is why the great Hopper bequest came here, by the way, because she was the first to show Hopper's work. She was the first to show John Sloane's work. She was the first to show many artists who, in a particular tradition, by the way, in the sort of figurative tradition out of Aikens. The Stieglitz group was not encouraged by Mrs. Whitney, which is an interesting historic. It was at the same period, around 1917. So anyway, by 1930 she had 500 pictures. Not because she was collecting pictures, but because she was dispatching people to give money to artists through purchase of works of art. And there's a story she often used to say, buy the worst one, save the best one for someone else. Because she really only wanted to transfer the money to the hands of the artist, but she did it through his commodity, which was a work of art, and which is an interesting way of doing it. Anyway, she had 500 pictures. She was the greatest patron of 20th century painting in 1930 without even trying. And she offered the pictures to the Met, and they refused them. And then she decided to found this museum, so she founded the museum.
Well, wasn't there some later stage where the Whitney and the Met were going to merge, and then that was called off?
Not that I'm aware of.
I think...
There may have been.
Yes, I think there was.
There was a great transfer of property, the great scheme to transfer property between museums. Is that what you mean?
No, at one year, the Whitney and the Metropolitan had announced plans to merge. It was the art news of the year, and the art news of the following year was that they had unannounced those plans.
Well,
What is
the Modern has not been interested.
What is the unique character of this museum? You called it the foremost museum of American art. How is it different from other museums?
Well, it's completely devoted to American art. There are very few of those. It's primarily devoted to the work of the 20th century American art, and it's the most active in the field.
You mentioned, too, that this is obviously not a one-museum town, and you say that you are primarily interested in 20th century art. Is there a kind of gentleman's agreement among the museums in this town and what they will focus on?
No. I mean, we don't all sit around a table and say, you get yours, I'll get mine. The Met is obviously interested in, it's an encyclopedic, great international museum.
I mean in terms of American art.
Well, their American collections are primarily, their strength of their American collection is in the 19th century. The strength of this collection, of course, is in the 20th century. The strength of the Museum of Modern Art is in the School of Paris. They're Braques, Matisse, Picassos. There has been a strong interest in the 20th century, particularly in the abstract expressionist period, which this museum didn't follow as well as it should have. So their strength in that period is much greater than ours. But the depth that this museum has in 20th century American art exceeds the depth that the modern has. And I think they have pursued, Dick and I have never discussed this. I've never discussed it with Bill Rubin, but I just observe them like everybody else, that their emphasis is more on School of Paris painting. Now, that's what it was founded for.
Will the opening of an American wing at the National Gallery in Washington change your prospects and your market, so to speak?
Well, they have this wonderful patron who can write very large checks, and he outclasses me, I'll tell you that. No, I don't know. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Carter Brown's car is the first one in the driveway an awful lot of the time, and he wants to establish, American art is very, it is creating tremendous public interest. And it's, a lot of museums now are developing their American wings who never were interested in American art before. And the competition for 20th century painting is extremely keen. And I think Carter wants to have a definitive collection of 20th century painting, which I would want to be there as well.
Is that possible to acquire so quickly?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know what the tax laws are going to do, but I think you're going to see a lot of private collections going into public institutions or going on the block and not going from one generation to the next. So that two or three single collections in this country could join together at the National Gallery would make it a sensational situation.
Are there any prospects for donations of those collections that you're aware of?
Well, private collectors. Hey, what station is this going to be on anyway?
It's not going to be.
Is it remote?
It's very remote. In fact, speaking of stations, what do you think of the coverage of the arts in the United States, both in print and electronically?
It's pretty bad. It's very bad on television.
Bad in what way?
Well, there is no scholarly presentation of criticism of art on television, period. The performing arts are ahead of us. The performing arts have always been ahead of the visual arts, at least in my lifetime, because they, it's more fun. Snap your fingers. It's much more empathetic, and the public responds to it much quicker. And, you can have, it's just better for encouragement of support, so that you see dance on television now. Wonderful dance on television. I must say that we're involved in something fascinating. Exxon, I think it's Exxon. Exxon has gone to a filmmaker and given him the challenge of producing 2 one-minute films on exhibitions opening in New York this fall, and the Calder exhibition was chosen. And they didn't even come to us. They went to the filmmaker. The filmmaker then came to us. They want to do that totally as a public service, to slot in on cable TV or Channel 13.
Excuse me for a moment.
Yeah.
We have to, every 20 minutes, change the cassette.
But
So we're going
let's
to
keep
intrude.
talking.
Now's your chance.
If you're smart, you don't tell anybody till the last day who's going to get it, because you'll be pursued forever.
How long?
So,
Yes. And is there anyone that's outside that would like to be inside? Okay.
anybody inside like
I
you?
was afraid to ask that. I said, you don't dare ask. The last thing we were talking about was coverage, both electronically and in print, of the arts in the United States.
Well, I was just telling you about this project, which is an
Please.
indication of recognition by certain people that the arts should be more visually presented on television. The difficulty of television is nobody's really come to grips with how to present it. I mean, how to present art. Those pannings and those goings in on the little haystacks and all that stuff.
You're blaming it on a technical
Yeah, I really am.
problem.
I don't think anybody has done a great
You think
job.
there's an administrative problem as well?
No.
That the amount of time allotted isn't sufficient?
No. I think the interest is so strong that if somebody came out with a gangbusters number, I think there'd be a lot of enthusiasm. I really do.
Well, I don't know if
I think the challenge is on
sponsors
the
and channels
interpreter.
agree with you.
Well, maybe
In any
not.
event, some of the recent shows here have not been kindly received. Is there pressure from trustees as a result of that?
One of my trustees called me the other day and said, no trustee likes anything unpleasant. And I think that be our guide. No, they don't like it. They're very embarrassed. They go to their places for lunch, or they go to their tennis club, or they go to wherever they go, and somebody says, hey, I see you got this rotten show at the Whitney. What the hell do you belong to that museum for? And the guy's very embarrassed, and, it's an embarrassment. And it takes great courage for a trustee to stand up to his buddy and say, well, why don't you come and see it, when it's Richard Tuttle and it's a piece of rope on the wall.
Who determines what is shown here?
The staff determines the shows.
And how much interference is there from non-professional
None.
persons?
None.
Who are the trustees of this museum, and by what right are they trustees?
Trustees are selected by other trustees, and they are people interested in the arts, interested in New York, interested in public institutions, interested in education, and any other good activities that contribute to this sort of thing. One of the it's a tough job to be a trustee, and that's one of the problems today. Trustees are finding it's much tougher to be a trustee than it ever was in the past. And
Why
that
is it more difficult for them?
because they are suddenly responsible for the institution. And the trustees of the Boston Museum, I keep mentioning let's say the Cleveland Museum, in 1930 or whenever, I don't know any of these details, I'm just using, but most trustees, it's been a social institution. The Museum on the Hill, they were given the job probably because they were prominent in the community. It wasn't as expensive. There was probably a meeting at the end of the year. They passed checks. Sturgis Ingersoll used to tell me that they made up the deficit by collecting checks at the end of the year at the Philadelphia Museum.
They've done that, I guess, forever. I can recall reading an item about the Metropolitan Museum in the 1910s, and there was a deficit of $990-some-odd thousand at the end of one season, and of course the trustees made up that deficit.
Right. Well, you don't have that kind of private wealth anymore. You don't have, we're aware of anyway. You have tremendous expense. This museum costs $3 million a year to run. Our endowment and other sources of income generates $1.5 million, so that less than $1.5 million. So each year, to keep this place going, we have to raise $1.5 million. That just didn't happen in the past. And trustees are realizing this responsibility, and they're nervous. And
Where
I don't
does that
blame them.
$1.5 million come from?
Foundations, not so much foundations
To
for
what
us.
degree?
anyway.
Perhaps you can describe to us.
Well, the major sources of support for us are the federal government and the state government and corporations.
Is that the National Endowment?
The National Endowments, the Arts Endowment, and the Humanities Endowment, and the New York State Council for the Arts, on the Arts, and corporations who we can convince on a project basis that we have an activity that would be of interest to the public and is a worthy association for them.
What about membership and admissions? Does that
Admissions,
make any considerable dent?
yes, it certainly does. Admissions is very important to us, and when which is reflected in our program, that we try to have a balanced program, so that we will appeal to the general public as well as a narrower public, which is only interested, say, in the most avant-garde material.
Who is your public? Who's interested in contemporary art?
It's a much smaller public than anyone realizes. We have 300,000 visitors a year, which is a very small public. This museum could only handle about 1,000 people. It should only handle about 1,000 people a day. If 1,000 people came in here every day, we would be very frazzled. So that 500,000 is, I think, probably our max. Anyway, it's a small museum. Our public and the art world, the avant-garde public is heaviest here in New York, so I think you get a disproportionate idea of who it is because it's concentrated here in New York and almost everybody you know is interested in it if you're at all in the art world. If you go to Soho, or if you go to the galleries on Saturday, or if you're involved in a membership in the Modern or here or the Guggenheim and so forth, so that you have this idea that everybody knows about modern art. Well, if you go out to Summit, New Jersey, where I grew up, they don't know who Jasper Johns is. And it's true. 20 miles away from here, they hardly know, very few people know anything about avant-garde contemporary art. And that's the general picture throughout the United States, except for little pockets around the Contemporary Museum in Philadelphia, around the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, Los Angeles, California, or Seattle. And there are only about 8 cities that have any sort of activity in contemporary art. And it isn't taught. Contemporary American painting is not taught in most universities, so we're not doing anything to help this situation in depth.
Well, one of the most famous and most appreciated of American artists is Alexander Calder. He was the first American who won the Venice Biennale since Whistler, and that was as far back as 1952. So his name is really very well known to many Americans, as is his work. I think it was less than a decade ago that he had a major retrospective in New York, and I'm sure you're going to have lots of happy trustees because you're going to have very good reviews.
We all came down to look at the line this morning.
But
first time in a long time, I want to tell you.
But why a Calder show at this time?
Why a Calder show at this time? Well, it's a particular type of Calder show. If you look at it carefully, it handles 17 different areas of his work in a very highly selected fashion. It's a rather small exhibition spread out over a lot of space, where some of the work is very large. It grew out of its genesis was a book that was being written by Jean Lippman for Viking. And when we heard about this and when she told us she was engaged in this activity, we thought it would make a wonderful show, because there is a generation, every 10 years is quite a bit of time, there's a generation, particularly children, who don't know Calder. He is still alive, can participate in this exhibition, can be seen by children on television, can be seen by us all on television, can sort of add to the aura of the exhibition tremendously. A wonderful man, and he has done so much in the last 10 years. Also, we've rediscovered and presented quite a few things to the public which have been forgotten. So it seemed timely. He is undoubtedly the most acclaimed, internationally acclaimed artist today, and it was great fun to celebrate him.
What are the parts of his work that have not been seen for a long while?
I don't think people are aware of his theatrical productions. We found some pieces that he made for the World's Fair, for instance, that had been lost. His production of toys, commercial production of toys, various things like that. And we've discovered some early material. You can go into his studio and discover a lot under the table that he has even forgotten. Amazing thing, though, he came in the other day, and this is a man 78 years old. He came in the other day, and a museum in France had sent us the wrong piece. So nobody knew how to put it up. We didn't have a photograph of it. And he walked in and said, oh, it goes like this, and made it. And it's a piece he had made in 1936, and to the best of our knowledge, he hadn't seen it since it went to that museum. I don't know when it went to them, but it was a very old piece, and he remembered it. He remembers all these materials. And he's made a tremendous, walk him down Madison Avenue, you can see how much he's made.
That's true. When the Calder show was at the Guggenheim, it was the most widely attended show in their history.
That's right.
So I wonder how far you think your audience can be expanded, particularly that combined with advertising on television now, which will certainly bring even more people to the museum.
Well, you
I
see,
think that the real question is, how great is the pressure on you for box office?
well, nobody says, let's have a, blockbuster. But the pressure is to keep the museum open. And if someone would give me $2 million, we could, be open a lot with nobody. What I'd love to do is hang up the permanent collection. And what we have to do slowly is educate the public to the permanent collection, so there'll be as much excitement about coming in here and seeing 40 Hoppers and 5 O'Keeffes and Marins and so forth, and Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg and all that, as there is with this, moving, wonderful Calder extravaganza. We try to balance it so that we will do a Robert Irwin exhibition next February.
When does the Hopper exhibition open?
1980.
And how many Hoppers are there here?
Lots. Well, there's a misunderstanding about this, and to you viewers, I'd like to say that we have 2,000, I think it is, Hopper items. But a lot of that is sketches from the Art Students League and works, minor works, memorabilia. But it's a fantastic corpus of material to produce the life study of this man. The issue, however, is major works. The bequest did not contain a high percentage of major works. And this is a point I have to get across, that if we're going to make Hopper an important artist, if we're going to present him importantly in this museum, we have to do it through major works of art, not a lot of minor material. And this has never really been brought out.
And among those 2,000 objects, how many of them would you consider major works?
60, max.
Among other things, this museum is famous for its biennial. In the last several years, it's been a subject of controversy and criticism. In the light of that, do you plan to change its focus or the criteria for inclusion for this coming year?
If I tell you about the biennial, you have to promise me you'll come, all right? When I became director, yeah, right, you are believers, to sit on this floor. We can stand up in a minute and relax during cassette time. When I arrived here, I had the impression that the Whitney had produced a biennial with, anybody does. I mean, you have buddies and you have alliances and just certain things had gone on. I really wanted to change it, and which is probably a very unfair statement, but never mind. I will have alliances and make judgments over and over again, so in 10 years somebody ought to come in and knock it all out of me. I decided to do it entirely differently. So last year we had a show for, 2 years ago we had a show for artists who had never been seen in New York in depth, which included a lot of New York artists and a lot of artists from all over the country. Highly criticized, because a lot of it wasn't important material, but it was a lot of artists who were being seen for the first time. It was a general survey of a certain level of the art world, and I was criticized primarily because, is that the level the Whitney Museum ought to be dealing with? And it's very unfair to the public who comes here presumably to see the best in American art, and we are doing this very parochial number. And I agree with the criticism, but I thought it was timely to do the exhibition. This year we're making a statement, or in February we are making a statement about 40 artists that we feel have made the greatest contribution to the development of American art in the 70s. Included will be approximately 30 artists who are extremely well known, and then we've gone into the field and will include approximately 10 artists whom we feel have made this contribution, but it's unknown. I mean, there will be unknown artists, relatively unknown artists in the exhibition. Each artist will be shown by 3 to 5 works, which is the first time we've ever done that. And there will be 20 video artists in addition to the 40, because video is a product of the 70s. It's a very important element of the art today, and we felt it was important to feature it in this fashion.
How involved with films and video and photography is the Whitney?
Very. Through the Board of Trustees, by the way. I mean, you talk about Board of Trustees and everybody thinks they're those horrible people. Trustees, about 5 or 6 years ago, realized that there was a movement in film that was not being assisted. New American filmmakers had no place to continuously be able to present their work for judgment and subsequent showing to the public. So we developed something called a New American Filmmaker series, which is primarily non-commercial films. We show these, as you know, weekly. They're always reviewed in the New York Times, and they're distributed by the American Federation of Arts. So we are giving these filmmakers a review, good or bad, but it's a review and the distribution of their work. It was never supported by anyone except an anonymous gift of $4,000 2 years ago, and now we have a grant from the Jerome Hill Foundation to assist us in this. We've also been given a grant from the Rockefeller Brothers for video equipment, for hardware, and we are now in the video business. We're not collecting it, but we're showing it, and a great deal of our program will be the presentation of video. If you saw the last program, it was a video program. So our curator is now the curator of film and video at the Whitney Museum.
You may get to see yourself here.
Not
What
No.
is the film attendance annually?
It's hard to tell because everybody who pays admission can see the film, and we don't normally clock it at the door. So for the price of admission, you can go to the film. The film attendance is very good. It's a very loyal group of people who really like our films and who come over and over again. And then we hit special interest areas, that attracts a different audience.
How does a man who was a businessman a little more than 10 years ago end up as the director of the country's foremost Museum of American Art?
Luck. The right place at the right time, the right age, enthusiasm, drive, all those things. No, it is odd. It is
Explain
odd.
that change of career.
I was a painter when I was young, and I'm the last of the generation, I think, who was ultimately was told by their father, do what I do, and who believed in doing it. I was a painter at Cornell. I went there to be a farmer. I'd always had this problem. Those testing service on 62nd Street has had me in there about 4 times. I can declare a dividend. I'd always been interested in farming, and also I was the artist around. I went to Cornell for agriculture and realized that it was the wrong thing for me because the men I was studying with were going home to their family farms. They're going to be county agents. I couldn't afford to buy a cow. So I switched to fine arts, which is where I had it over them. And I excelled in this, went off in the Army, painted, came back, and then I got the word. I didn't get the word as much as, well, I did, but from my father, but I also got the word from the economics of the situation. Lee Ault offered me a job at Vision, Inc. for $60 a week, I think, and Stone & Webster Incorporated offered me a job as working for the president of the company for something like $140, and the economics of the situation were pretty overwhelming. I worked for Stone & Webster for 8 years. I was assistant to the chairman of the board. It was in the early 60s. I was running with a group of men my age who loved making money. They were fascinated with making money, and this is when 30-year-old men were making $200,000 and $300,000 a year on Wall Street. They had no other interest. And I didn't have that interest. And so I went back to 62nd Street, back to the testing service, and did the square hole number. And they said, have you ever considered the fine arts field, the business aspects of it, and the association of your two interests, or your background? So I went off to NYU. I may as well tell this. With Colin Eister, if you know Colin, he's a very gentle, sympathetic man, was my advisor, and Robert Goldwater. I lasted a year and a half. I was not accepted in the museum training program the Met was producing. I went to Craig Smythe and said, Mr. Smythe, I've come here to get this degree, but basically I've come back to get this familiarity with the profession I've not been involved with for a long time, the language. And I want to be in that museum training course. I have a wife, 2 kids. I'm going in the museum profession with or without it, but I want it. He said, no one knows you here, Mr. Armstrong. And I said, well, if no one knows me after a year and a half, I think it was a school of 80 people or 90, I said, there's no need to stay. And I'd been offered a job as curator of the Rockefeller Collection because I'd been there on a summer intern program. And I went down to Williamsburg, and we were there for 5 years. And at that time, it was an institution run very much by one man. And the folk art aspect of it was really a custodial situation that was becoming equally as important as any other part of Williamsburg, but hadn't been recognized. And this one man wasn't interested in it, and there was no place to go. I mean, you could thrash around there forever. And when you work in a town like Williamsburg, you make $12,000, you have a 1-bedroom house, you make $14,000, they move you up the street and you get 2 bedrooms. They have you kind of locked in. I didn't like that, and so I left.
Excuse me. Going to stop for a moment.
And I was involved in this affair.
It seems that museums suffer from identity crisis too. One of the topics that are discussed more and more often is the future direction of museums. Should they be repositories to exhibit and conserve? Should they be educational institutions? What do you see as the future of museums in general and the Whitney specifically?
I don't think the future for museums in general is very bright. And I think it's something that should begin to alarm us all. I don't think well, gosh, if you read the paper, you know that the future of so many institutions that we really have begun to take for granted until a couple of years ago, like the Metropolitan Opera, for instance. I mean, to read that it may go out of business is very upsetting. There are museums in this country that are in very bad trouble, great museums. Hartford, the Wadsworth Athenaeum is in tremendous trouble. I mean, any museum allied with city funding, with so many cities in trouble, is consequently in trouble. The Philadelphia Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, so forth. So the future of these institutions, of the institution in terms of a social institution, depending upon both civic and private funds, is in trouble. Now, in terms of the types of programs and so forth, I don't know. I know the program for this museum. I mean, this museum, and you're going to read an awful lot about this soon because we're about to be taken on by various people. This museum is maturing, and it's maturing in terms of the fact that it has collected art for almost 50 years, and yet it has never paid much attention to that art. It has been a Kunsthalle, it's been an exhibition hall. And the cry around the staff room is, well, let's do a Perm Call show next summer, permanent collection exhibition in the summer. Well, if it has an educational function, and I strongly believe it does, that function is allied to its permanent collection. And it is time now for this museum to face the facts about its permanent collection. Now, as the alternative to this, you have something like the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, which is a Kunsthalle, which has no collection. But because of vanities and ambitions of the people around it, and it's a very serious problem, they're going to begin collecting. And they're going to be in my situation soon. But what the healthy situation would be is that they would be an exhibition center to do all these sort of turnovers of exhibitions, played against a permanent installation or attention to a permanent collection in an institution like this. There's no place in this country to go and see a representative selection of 20th century American art.
You've emphasized the permanent collection several times in our conversation, and you also made passing reference to being taken on by several people. Can you clarify what that means and what your plans are for the permanent collection?
Well, we're going to exhibit it. You can read as well as I how we're going to be taken on tomorrow in the New York Times. Grace Click and Art Talk. We're going to start showing a portion of the permanent collection at all times in next February on the second floor. It's what it was designed for but never been used for. It's the one with the wooden floors and so forth. Slowly we will begin to base exhibitions on aspects of the permanent collection. The Hopper Show, for instance, as well as the same type of, we're not going out of business in support of contemporary artists. We're definitely not going out of business in the contemporary field. No one wants to do that. We want, though, to balance it, and it's a question of priorities. And at this point, it seems to me, and to those around me, that it is time for a shift in emphasis in this museum, and an emphasis must be placed on the permanent collection to give a reference point to our exhibition of the most avant-garde material and the best material that's being produced tomorrow.
And when does this shift take place?
Well, it begins in '77 in February. And for the first time, we now have a curator of the permanent collection. There has never been a curator of the permanent collection in this museum.
What are the origins of painting in this country?
Sap. The same, I want to change the question. It's much easier to understand in sculpture. It's much more visually understood in sculpture. If you saw our sculpture show, the origins of art in this country are trying to do it as good as they did it over there until about 1910. 1913, and then you see American artists beginning to pull out of this overwhelming reflection and look back at Europe. Now, there is a strong American tradition in painting, but it is undermined. It's grounded by this impact of the authority of European art. All during the 90s, and it's especially true in sculpture. You see all that classic sculpture in the 19th century. Then you see the beginnings of modernism, and you see people like Nodelman and so forth, Joseph Cornell, Louise Nevelson, Calder. You see these people sort of pull out of it, David Smith, and then you see people like the great artists of the 50s who made an absolutely original statement, and that's why their work is so revered, and that's when American painting and American art caught on. I mean, that's when it just riveted right in.
What is the importance and the role of folk art currently?
Folk art is an enigma because folk art was collected by the artists around 1913 who were looking for something innately American in our tradition as a reference point for the development of their own work. And I can document this. A lot of it happened around Ogunquit, Maine, where there's an art colony. And they began collecting because it is basically very abstract, because the artists producing it didn't know the academic principles of painting and sculpture. So without knowing it, and without the ability to employ academic principles like chiaroscuro and one-point perspective and all that sort of thing, they made abstract pictures and objects, shallow space, light coming from all directions, that sort of thing. So the artists collected it in terms of its aesthetic connections with the type of work they were producing. That's why Edith Halpert handled it. She handled Sheeler at the same time she handled M.I. Phillips. Hard edge. It's a 20th century rediscovery by 20th century artists. And I would like very much for this museum to collect it, because I think it should be seen with the art that it's allied with. It is not allied. It's a parallel tradition with academic art in the 19th century, but it is very unlike it. It is much more allied to 20th century abstract art.
What is your favorite period?
My favorite period is today. I mean, a lot of people think I'm old and stodgy and really like folk art because I was the curator down there in Williamsburg. And I really think today is very important. I think that's why this museum is here. It's why it's always going to be here. To support American artists, living American artists, and to encourage the public to understand their work. And this has to be done, however, with a depth.
There are several questions that we are asking each of our guests, and one of them is, who is your favorite painter?
Oh, God. I don't know. I would never answer that question. Did anybody else?
Everyone did.
Who's Tom Messers?
Paul Klee.
Paul Klee, eh? Oh, I don't deal in, favorite painters is one thing, favorite works of art is another.
Well, and what are your favorite works of art?
Well, I would pick Ada Kooning.
A specific one?
Probably the woman owned by the Museum of Modern Art. I would pick a great Copley. I have never really understood Akins. I mean, I'm not going to say an Akins because he's a mystery to me, I'm not saying. Copley is an overwhelming artist. That's a great painting upstairs if you don't know Copley. Why don't we just leave it at that?
If you were going to buy 3 works of art for this museum and price were not a factor or an object, what would you select? Let's play What in the World.
Well, I would have bought Lavender Mist. It was the last great Pollock, and it was the greatest Pollock in this country. And we don't have $2 million. I would then, I wouldn't buy in terms, I don't, if I had $100,000, I would buy today the Bolotowski that's up in the boardroom for $21,000 that I am having great difficulty raising money for, which is the 1939 study for the mural at the World's Fair. I can't raise money, by the way, for the purchase of older American artists and artists of the 20s. All the money that we have been very successful in raising in the last 2 years is for living artists. I mean, for today, sort of like the 20 to 50-year-old, people who've made their name in the last 20 years, or are making it today. All right, I'd buy the Bolotowski. I would buy some Marston Hartleys that I happen to know about. And this all has to do with what I see, fitting in here and there.
Needs of the collection. What's your greatest pleasure in
I'd buy a Pollock. I mean, a Jasper Johns.
What is your greatest pleasure in being director of this museum?
Everybody get asked that too? No, I have certain objectives for it, and just personally, some sort of satisfaction that maybe those objectives are being attained. It's very hard to be in this business because it's so public. And I'm a little too sensitive for the job. And so I don't talk to the press, because you've seen I sort of let it all out. And it can be so misconstrued. It hurts a lot, me, when we are criticized. Because I take this place very seriously, and I think we try to make a good effort. And I don't think we're criticized a great deal of the time in terms of the premise of what we're trying to do. And I would love to get in a conversation about, is it right or wrong to do this? And then how well did you do it? Rather than, isn't it a mess? And we often get criticized in terms of that. My greatest pleasure is just doing it,
Well, other than money, what is your largest single problem?
Zap. Finding talent to deal with what we're doing, and not just here, but the critical talent, the producing talent, and the ongoing, the people that we need to make this place work.
You mean curatorial talent, too?
Yeah.
Is that a problem?
It's a great problem. Tremendous problem. Because there's so few. There's so few people in the field. There's so few places for them to work to begin with. There's so few places for them to come out of. And it's a difficult problem. It's not difficult, for instance, I don't know the field, but I don't think it's difficult to find, well, it's certainly not difficult to find a good lawyer, right? It's not difficult to find a good architect. There are a lot of them out there wishing you would find them. But it's very difficult to find a good curator of 20th century art who is interested in being very tough, being very serious, interpreting the work or presenting the work to the public, and writing well about it in an understandable way, and being totally devoted to the museum function, which is a public function.
How do you recommend that someone go through a museum?
I usually run through to see what's happening. I do that in an exhibition. You know, I leave my wife behind and go zzz, and see, and then come back and slowly go at it. Most museums' exhibitions are programmed a certain way, and it's if you want to do it the way it was set up, you should try to find out. For instance, the Calder Show has a path. They want you to go a certain way. And they've got a big white arrow up there that I'm going to take down. I don't care what way you go, but I mean, the big white arrow is worse than the mistake you might make by going right.
When you say
you're supposed to go left.
When you say they, one would assume that you are also they. How does
I didn't
that
put up the white
occur?
arrow.
How does that occur?
Well, we hired a designer for this exhibition. It's a very complicated installation. We don't have a very large staff. We don't have a designer on staff. We don't have a designer of installations. We don't have a designer of written material. Everything is freelanced. And I didn't think we had the talent on the staff to install this exhibition properly. So we went outside, and the man and I got in an argument over the lighting the other day. Of course, I can always change it when he goes away. So I didn't see there was any reason for lighting it. Arguing with him, we lit it, and he lit it very well. But he didn't. A couple of running a museum, you have a sensitivity to light shining in people's eyes when they come around corners and stuff like that, which we will adjust. But he lit it in a special way, which I let him do. It's his show. I mean, he designed the installation. If I definitely don't like it, I change it, because whatever is done, it reflects on the museum and me.
As I recall, you hired outside people to design the 200 Years of Sculpture show, too. Was that Venturi and Rausch?
Right.
Now, how does the permanent staff, many of whom know a great deal about sculpture as well, react to something like that?
They don't like it.
Well, how do you compromise the two?
You tell them. It's going to be this way. The difficult thing is when they fight you, sabotage you, and it can be devastating because you don't know until it's happened. And everybody who's in the art game loves to play with objects. I mean, objects are it, or whatever the phenomenon is. And if you can't, you can acquire it, you can help somebody get it, you can get it in here, and if you aren't the one that's going to put it there so the public understands it just the way you understand it, you're very disappointed. And it is a problem, and I understand that. But
Talk about exhibiting the permanent collection, and obviously, too, there is limited space in this museum. The Museum of Modern Art has engaged in a rather precedent-making move that will not only provide additional space, but additional revenue. Does this museum have any plans for towers or any other things?
this museum is just trying to get it together right here. That's it. And if we can do that, we've done a great job.
What are some of your future exhibits?
I mean, let me tell you, our endowment's only $10 million, which is the growth of Mrs. Whitney's original gift of $2 million. Income for acquisition of art until last year was $20,000 a year. This museum, it's a fascinating museum because its impact and its production far exceeds what one would expect is its backup. It's a mom and pop store. Somebody described it as that the other day. It really is. I rearranged the plants this morning after the party.
What are some of your future exhibits?
We have the biennial, And then we're doing the
And
Robert...
tell us the dates too, please.
Ye gods, I don't know. The biennial is in February, all right? Which will take up the third and fourth floors, and the permanent collection installation will begin on the second floor, which will run right on. Next exhibition on the third floor is a fascinating exhibition of 17th and 18th century American Indian robes, which were the latest of which is 1759, the fall of Quebec, which were collected by French traders from Indians and sent to Paris, to France, and have been in the basement of the Musée de l'Homme and never seen for eons. And we are bringing 23 of these over, and with a wonderful book associated with this by a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And this was all brought to us by a private, the interest in this was mentioned to us by a private individual, which is a fascinating way of hearing. We wouldn't have known if this person had seen them in this closet at the Musée de l'Homme. Okay, then the fourth floor after the biennial is Robert Irwin, who will transform that space in terms of changes of perception, light, space, environment, and so forth, which will be totally mystifying to the general public, but very beautiful, I might. And it was a great success in Chicago when he had a show about 2 years ago. Then we will do the Diebenkorn exhibition, and then we'll have a show, the Diebenkorn show. After that, I don't know what we're doing.
Jasper Johns?
Jasper Johns is in the fall. 2 floors devoted to Jasper Johns for most of next fall, with a book and a catalog essay by Michael Crichton. Now there's something...
You should explain that counterpoint.
There is something you can read about, because that's going to be a problem.
Why do you foresee that as a problem? Besides everything else, you'll have a bestseller instead of a catalog.
Yeah.
Are there
Did you read
regional-
The Great Train Robbery?
Yeah.
If he can do for Jasper Johns what he did for The Great Train Robbery. Excuse me.
After you.
No, the problem is that the art community has been sort of ignored in terms of writing about Jasper Johns, and if you are an art historian, you would want to make a statement about Jasper Johns, and I chose to do it other ways. I wanted a writer who I thought was highly readable, very intelligent, fascinated by the artist, collects his work, knows him, is interested in lots of things that Johns is. I mean, the impact of just, well, very simply, letters and numbers. And I just thought it would be interesting. There is a great essay on Johns by Robert Rosenblum. Other people have made quite definitive statements about Johns up to a point. And I felt this would be a new approach. It was time for a new way to look at Jasper Johns, a way the public can understand.
Has the museum catalog ever been a Book of the Month Club selection?
Yeah, it has.
Which one?
Strangely, 200 Years of American Sculpture was a Book of the Month Club. American Folk Art was a Book of the Month Club. I meet a group of people around New York who are always saying to me, that was a wonderful American show you did. And what they mean, usually they're ladies in little mink coats, they meant the folk art show. It's an incredibly successful exhibition for us, and most people haven't been, a lot of people who went to that haven't been back.
Well, we hope they come soon, and thank you for having us here tonight. Tom Armstrong, Director of New York's Whitney Museum. Now it's time for the class to share in the interviewing process, and what we're going to do is we have one microphone. Lawrence, if you will hold it up, and if you will raise your hand, I will... I think, no, actually, this is still being taped, Tom, and I think that this should pick it up. And if you can't hear it, will you tell us? Sorry? Then you're ready for the thing. But I think that this should pick it up without the microphone, so before we pass it, do you think this will pick up the sound from around the room? Why don't you try it now? Just tell us, Lawrence, tell us your name or anything, you know, so that we can just, without the microphone, to see if I turn this to you.
Can you hear me? Is it saying enough for you?
It's okay.
Well, you were talking a louder voice than
What's
that.
the problem with using it?
Because there are people all around the room and a big lot of time.
Okay.
Yell a little.
Yes.
made a very strong statement concerning future financial value of Gladys Nielsen. And if that is true, I was wondering how you still feel about her work, due that it seems that of the Chicago images, her work seems to have gone up the least in the last 2 years.
When you say me, do you mean the museum?
Well, I believe the statement came from you as far as her watercolors.
When? Now?
No, in the past sometime.
I know Gladys Nielsen, but I'd never tell you anything about the financial value of an artist's work. It just is not part of my...
I must have been misled.
No, I'm sorry. She's a very good watercolor painter, and she's married to a very good artist, Jim Nutt.
This program that you have for unknown filmmakers, would you ever consider doing something similar for, like, devoting a small room in the museum to painting and sculpture of unknown artists?
The question was, would we devote, since we do new American filmmakers, would we devote a room in the museum to unknown artists? Well, this room is devoted to unknown artists. Not constantly, but it's one of its program aspects is artists who do not have dealers or have had one-person shows in New York. The Biennial does that as well. This is a great question, whether a museum should be doing this. And we could argue it all night.
Well, it would be on such a small scale that it really wouldn't...
That's it. This is it. We do it.
With your image.
We do it.
Are there other questions?
You said that the Whitney Museum was on the threshold. I wonder if you'd clarify that.
The question was that the Whitney Museum was on the threshold, and I believe you did, but will you once again clarify what that means?
Well, I mean, in terms of it is maturing, devoting itself to its permanent collection, becoming internationally recognized as the best museum of 20th century American art. American art has incredibly renewed interest devoted to it, directed toward it. I think we're on the threshold of the potential of doing great things with an increasing public, because the awareness of American art is greater, and we are becoming a much more serious museum in terms of the historic position we have in the presentation of American art. Does that make any sense at all?
Questions?
This was a question that you sort of answered before, but I'd like to get a clarification. You started to describe the functions of a curator. I wonder if you could do this in a more comprehensive way, what a curator's responsibilities are.
We'll have to deal with the ideal, all right? Because the ideal gets directed into a person's really great, specific and personal talents. A curator is primarily involved in whatever the museum does. Now, we collect, preserve art, all right? A curator should understand that. Should assist in the collection, preservation of art. A curator is involved in the art and should be the person who presents exhibitions, interprets art, writes about it. It's very simple. It gets very mixed up.
What is the responsibility for identifying additions to the collection?
The curator.
Is the question the man in the blue?
You don't seem to think it's true.
No.
It's a great smirk. Oh, well, I mean, all right, a curator goes around and sees, we have one Lichtenstein. Can you imagine this museum having one Lichtenstein? We have one Rothko. We have one, the museum in the past has had a sort of, let's get one of everything. It has not had the guts to say, Lichtenstein's the best, so-and-so isn't quite as good. Let's get 4 Lichtensteins and to hell with that guy. And we're getting there. And it's a very tough decision to have to make, but you just can't go on collecting one of everybody. So the curators are out looking for a great Lichtenstein.
The man in the blue suit.
I think you're performing, it seems to me that you're performing a very valuable service to the public in New York City. How are you trying to obtain federal money? Why isn't the government doing more to help museums that are in such straits as the Whitney is? It appears to me there's plenty of money around for arts, but it doesn't appear that the museums are getting the proper support that they should be getting.
The question is, why isn't the government doing as much as it should for the arts? This gentleman thinks there's plenty of money around and the museums aren't getting their fair share. I don't think your microphone was on, and when you pass it to other people, will you please check that it is? Anyone else?
Well, you always want more, but we are getting a lot of money from the federal government.
How much do you get annually?
Well, it depends on we get it mostly for program, but written into the program now is overhead. In other words, we used to just get money for the presentation of whatever we were doing that year, and in the de Souvreau catalog, the federal government was the only person, the only one who would give us money for the presentation of de Souvreau. U.S. Steel, all those guys whose materials, no way, he might get up and say they're communists or something. They were so afraid of him. They were so afraid of him.
Tom, is it a real problem when your corporate sponsor, who you try, each of you try, to give as much credit as possible, and when it is reflected in the press, either electronically or in print, somehow that mention is not made? How great a problem is that for return calls on that sponsor?
It isn't as great as the morning after you think it is. I mean, the president of Elena Rubinstein will call you and tell you they didn't mention me in the New York Times. They come back. They realize after a while that there's a catalog, they've made a permanent contribution to the literature on American art, that it isn't the review that happened to forget them. It isn't all that important. It's a little unnerving to the ego when they don't get in every article, but they're bigger than you think. The other money I wanted to tell you is overhead money, and we now are beginning to get the guards and keeping the lights on and so forth, and the government is building this in to their project requests. Yeah.
Whatever happened to the kangaroo Calder multiple you were supposed to be doing?
There's a kangaroo upstairs, and we were going to make a multiple of it, and we had permission to do it. We were going to do 100 of them. It just got to be such a production problem. We also suddenly realized there's probably no sales. And that sort of just stopped it. Go ahead.
The man in the round sweater.
Why weren't some of those people afraid
De Souvreau?
Why they objected, some of the corporate sponsors, what would their objection be to the work of de Souvreau, Marc de Souvreau?
Well, his biography does not elicit the corporate establishment. I mean, he left this country in protest because of the Vietnam War.
Oh, I thought it was more the work.
No. It's the man. That's what I said. They're scared of him. They're afraid he'll come with his shirt off or something to their dinner party. He probably would. But that isn't the point.
The downtown Whitney at 55 Water Street has done some superb things. Can you tell this group about them?
Sure. The downtown Whitney was an idea of Percy Uris's, who was building 55 Water Street. He thought it'd be great to have a museum in the building. He knew about this museum, and so he gave us, he's deceased now, in the building, the Uris brothers have been sold to Warner Communications, who's continued this. They give us space free. We couldn't create anything that would take off from our budget for running this museum. So the museum is run on a budget that is entirely raised south of 14th Street. It's raised by the element in the community which it serves, which is a fascinating concept. And it's run by students who come in to be with us for a term as independent study students from all over the country who have a project in art history and who we give tutors to proceed with their project. But in addition, they work in the branch museum, they're paid, they do everything. They hang up the art. They don't hang up the art. Our art hangers do that. But they guard the museum, they originate the exhibitions, they write whatever material is written out. There's a wonderful one there now. I've got to tell you about this woman who's there. The show is called Art World, and it is involved in artists who perceive that the systems of our life and so forth are works of art, or could be conceived of as works of art. So there's one woman who has organized, or who's solicited, the maintenance people in this building, and their buttons, I had one, I don't know what I've done with it, and they say, "I make maintenance art." And she's talked to all the cleaning ladies and the porters and so forth, and she's gotten them to wear this, and for 1 hour every night, they consider that dusting the desk is a work of art. And the fun part about it is that then she takes a photograph of them doing it. She dignifies it by taking the photograph. They put the photograph up in the Branch Museum. These people have become so involved in this thing, and they're so disappointed they can't see their picture. So we're having an opening next Tuesday at midnight. At midnight. For these people. Oh, I think it's a great way to dignify their activity. It's a work of art. It takes all their energies. And, if it's a work of art to them, and between them and the desk, it's probably a work of art. Shining a piece of silver. I've seen somebody shine a piece of silver and really go.
Do you consider some of these students potential curators? I mean, they're possible.
Oh, they are. They're all over the country right now, the people who've gone through this program.
So doesn't that satisfy your need for curators?
Sure, but they're young. They're in smaller museums now. They've only had the program 4 years, 5 years. Something. Sure, we have people on this staff who've gone through the program. Go ahead.
With all this money coming from the federal and the state government, who are the people that are giving this money or making the allotment? Are they people of the art world, or are they just somebody come up from the civil service? Are they responsible?
They're very responsible, and I'll tell you how it runs. I'll tell you the experience I'm having with an exhibition. All right, these 2 endowments, and one for the arts, one for the humanities. We want to do a show next year of William Carlos Williams and American painting 1920 to 1940. All right, Williams got very involved with artists. So we've written a proposal. It has been reviewed by a panel at the National Endowment for the Humanities and turned down because they brought in William Carlos Williams scholars and didn't like the way we were going. So they wouldn't give us the money.
I think we should explain, though, the strong presence that the Humanities Foundation is now making in the museum world, and the criteria include didactic expression, so that you would have to, in his proposal, demonstrate that the literary content of that show was sufficient to have it qualify as a humanities grant to differentiate it from an arts endowment grant.
It's a very complicated thing.
But in some way that does clarify why would the humanities endowment be making a judgment about an art exhibit.
But it just isn't civil servants, and it just isn't somebody sort of doling it out. It's the way it's been set up, and primarily by Nancy Hanks and her associates. Each request is reviewed by a professional group knowledgeable in whether or not the request has validity in both endowments. And it's a very good way, by the way, of... The problem with foundations is they don't do that. Foundations, that we've just given them up, most of them, because they have become such creative entities. They're sitting around and telling us, you really ought to be in this... They come with a project in hand and say, I will give you $50,000 if you will begin collecting a work by women over 90 or something.
You should explain that the endowments were formally enacted in 1965, and during that period of time, their techniques have been refined and more carefully defined. And these panelists, there is a staff, most of whom are civil servants, but there are outside panelists in each of the disciplines, all of whom have demonstrated expertise in their field. And I think it would be fair to say they range from high good to excellent.
Yeah, it's amazing. But it also should be recognized that the National Endowment for the Arts has done more for avant-garde contemporary art than any single group in this country. And half the things we do, we never would have been able to do. And it's really something. And it's never really been recognized because they're very low-key.
You said that you started out as a painter. I was curious if you ever paint anymore. No. Or I'm thinking of some exhibitions in particular, like the Human Concern and Personal Torment, which I loved, and the Gym Nut Show, things that are really offbeat like that. I don't know what the general public thought if those are things that got criticized. I love them. And I wonder how much of you as an artist goes into picking those things, and how much of you as the objective curator? Me
as an artist ended in 1954. The curators really recommend the exhibitions, and the entire staff chooses them. I can veto them, and I recommend, just like everybody else. But me, the artist, is part of me.
How often do you veto an exhibition?
About once a week.
How often do you seriously veto an exhibition?
Once a week. We have a staff meeting once a week.
Well, what was this week's candidate?
Shall I tell you? It may win, but no. What was it? My secretary's out there. I've forgotten what we beat. No, it was. Well, whatever it was an error.
Westlake knows everything.
Yeah, Patty. What did we give up this week? No, we had a curator who wanted to do a show of circus banners, and fascinating subject, by the way. Very interesting, and the artists you like, Jim Nutt, a lot of them, have really come out of those. I mean, have really been influenced by those freak show banners, and it's a very esoteric little part of the collecting world is those as well. And there's an element of the art world which is influenced by them. I felt right now, we've got much more important things to do than circus banners. So I said nix.
The woman, you'll have to stand up and speak up, please.
I'm sorry, it's so uncomfortable.
There were relatively few ways to learn about avant-garde art. In what ways
I think that we should repeat the question.
I can repeat it.
Please.
I said there were very few ways to learn about avant-garde art, and the question was how can the museum contribute to helping people become involved and learn? But we definitely want to. Lots of curators don't. The education departments of museums is a phenomenon of of the recent past. And we're really quite confused and thrashing around, wanting to know how to do things in terms of giving some benchmarks to somebody who comes in and sees something totally alien to them. Now, curators don't really like to do that. They believe in the integrity of the work. It's very hard for them to accept the fact that there is a bigger world than the people they're associating with all the time, who understand. So that's an education problem, all right, with the curators. Once you've gotten through that, then you look for ways to do it. Now, video tapes of the artist at work gives the public some concept of the process. Well, for instance, Irwin is an artist dealing with certain phenomena. Now, if you walk in and see that big scrim, which is going to look like a big sheet, the wall, when you got off the fourth floor, was an Irwin in the sculpture show. 4% of the people who came to the museum knew that. That was a mistake. We should have really led you into that. All right, he deals in certain phenomena. Somewhere there should be a shakedown to get you clued into the fact that the light in that room has been altered by this scrim, that the spatial context, and it relates to your life and the way you perceive and all that sort of thing. There are ways of doing it. The way that seems to be popular these days is labels like this big on the wall and the bill for the painting and this and that. That isn't it, I don't think, but we're struggling to find a way. I had a trustee who wanted me to take down the Richard Tuttle show the day after it opened. Okay? It was a tough time for him at the office that morning. I kid you not. At Solomon Brothers, everybody was talking about this trustee and what the hell was he doing at that museum, all right? So he calls me up, don't you really think we ought to take it down? I said, absolutely not. Now, we had a long meeting with him, and what developed was that he was really intimidated by it, and that he wanted to know desperately. It was some problem inside him, and he ached about it. Well, we should have helped him. And we should have given him some clue to get in there.
Did you ever convert him?
No. He's a wonderful trustee, though. I said I wanted to buy a Tuttle, and he gave me the money to buy one. So it isn't all bad. But he illustrated to me in a very dramatic way that there was something. I could have won him over by having some way of explaining Richard Tuttle to him, which we never attempted to do. We just strewn the work around. And we wrote a catalog. The curators think the catalog does it, you see. The catalog costs $6.
Right.
No
Thank you for explaining so much to us tonight, and thank you for letting us come
back. We're free Tuesday nights.
go away. I really have to photograph you. Before you go, yes, I would like two things. Next week, excuse me. Next week, we are at the Pace Gallery, and it is Louise Nevelson and Arnold Glimcher. It is a very limited space. There are no chairs. Please understand that as you did before you came to this course. Please bring your own cushion. And if you have any questions, for either of them, please leave them on your way out. Thank you all for coming tonight. You were divine, as always. Don't go away.
Things that they turned in last week?
One question, folk art. Nobody turns in a question. Hold on a sec. Each week, I ask for questions and I don't get them. I get one a week, but they ask very good ones themselves.
This is the question. This will be a week later.